Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Adler.
Welcome to the Teachers Retirement System Investment Meeting for June 7th, 2018. Patricia, would you please call the roll?
John Adler,
Present.
Thomas Brown,
Here.
David Kazansky,
Present.
Deborah Penny, here, Raymond Orlando,
I'm here.
Susanna Vickers, here. We do have a quorum.
Very good, thank you. So, Robin, we turn it over to you for our agenda.
Thank you. So on the public agenda, the first item is the quarterly performance report, which everyone has received beforehand. We've gone through the numbers previously, when we talked about the March performance at the last investment meeting. So I'm not sure there's a need to go through it unless anyone has specific questions.
Anyone have any questions for Robin about the March quarterly? Apparently not.
Okay. With that, maybe perhaps we could turn to the April report that you received. If we start with the Diversified Equity Fund, we can see that at the end of April, the Diversified Equity Fund totaled almost $15.4 billion. For the month, the total performance of that fund was almost 60 basis points. We saw modest positive returns in the U.S. equity market and a difficult month of performance for the active managed composite, which underperformed the Russell 3000 for the month. For the year to date, the total performance of the Diversified Equity Fund is slightly negative 20 basis points. And we can, if we turn to the defensive strategies on the next page, we can take a look at that sector's performance. So the sector has also lagged its benchmark slightly for both the month and on a year-to-date basis. So for the month, the sector was flat and detracted somewhat from the total fund returns. If we look at the performance for the international equity composite farther down the page on page 4, we can see that having an international equity allocation added significantly in terms of relative returns to performance for the month. For the month, the international equity composite was up almost 2%, lagging that benchmark slightly. For the year to date, similarly, the international equity composite has added to returns because it's out, that benchmark and composite have outperformed the U.S. equity market. So for the year to date, again, the Diversified Equity Fund, slight negative performance. We have, let's turn to little lost without Mike. If we turn to page 9, we can take a look at performance for other funds offered in the passport suite of funds. You could see for the month of April, the Balanced Fund was virtually flat, down 10 basis points. And the Balanced Fund Composite benchmark was up 10 basis points. For the year to date, the Balanced Fund total is down by about 70 basis points. So this theme of returns for both the month and the year to date period hovering around zero, either slightly negative or slightly positive. When we just looked at the international equity composite within the Diversified Equity Fund, the International Equity Fund, of course, same managers, same allocations, has similar returns, up almost 2% for the month, and for the year-to-date period, positive by 64 basis points. The Inflation Protection Fund, up by almost 1% for the month, and for the year-to-date period, slightly negative. And the Socially Responsible Fund, again, up slightly for the month, and for the year-to-date, up by about 100 basis points. So very muted returns for both the month and the year-to-date period. there's been, of course, a lot of volatility during that period of time, and these muted returns don't reflect that volatility, and we've seen lots of intraday and intramonth volatility. Any questions on the April period? If not, we can move forward to May. Less muted returns during the month of May. So if you look at the Russell 3000 return for the month, up almost 3%. And the international composite benchmark down almost 2.5%. So certainly less muted for the month. Defensive strategies benchmark up by about 200 basis points for the month as well. And so our estimate is that the diversified equity fund will have earned about 170 basis points for the month, which gives us a calendar year-to-date return of just about that, 170 basis points. So we entered May basically flat and earned 170 basis points, we think, during the month. The balanced fund benchmark is up by about 50 basis points, and you see that the international equity fund down by about 250 basis points during the month, driven primarily by the allocation to emerging markets, which had a significantly negative month in May, down over 600 basis points. If we look at the inflation protection fund, we expect about 113 basis points positive return for the month, and the Neuberger Berman socially responsive equity fund up closer to the Russell 3000 return, about 240 basis points. So much better returns for the U.S. equity market during the month of May, significantly negative returns for emerging market equity during the month of May. Any questions, comments?
I have a question.
Yes.
Rowan, can you talk a little bit about what's going on with the international equities?
In terms of
why they're down.
why they're down. Well, some of that is currency. A large component of that is currency. So dollar
that's
strength.
a strong dollar.
Dollar
versus
strength. Yes.
Okay.
And then some significant concerns, again, currency-based in the emerging markets, particularly Brazil, has been significantly impaired. So I think a lot of it is currency weakness, frankly. And in our view, the prospects for total returns, and no one, including us, can predict short-term or maybe even long-term currency moves, but in terms of relative valuations, we still think the non-U.S. markets offer greater opportunity, particularly the emerging markets, but also greater volatility. So we're not surprised by this month-to-month volatility, and would not change at this point our view on the outlook for those markets based on a relative valuation.
Sure. And then could you talk a little bit about the outlook for Europe, perhaps?
Yes, I think that's a complex question, but a good question. You know, I think there's been a lot of talk about the ECB not going as far as the U.S. has gone, but certainly slowing down the purchases of bonds, and at this point they're going to continue to reinvest their interest income from those bonds, and so they're not going to decrease their balance sheet exposure as the U.S. is doing. So less pressure on liquidity in Europe, which they still seem willing to do whatever is necessary to support those markets, and we're seeing positive inflation, so less worries about deflation. So things seem to be trending in terms of growth, in terms of stability, positive direction. Italy is a wild card, of course, and everyone here has been reading about Italy. So still a lot of uncertainty, but again, based on relative market valuations, we see a lot of volatility, but still see greater opportunity outside the U.S., including Europe, than in the U.S. equity market, just because the U.S. equity market has performed so well.
I've got grave concerns about the political risk in Europe as well
Yeah.
as the banking risk. They're continuing to be a functioning banking center going forward. Anyway, thanks.
Do you want to elaborate on that? I think that's relevant.
It's just, you know, the dysfunction that's occurring in Europe on the political side and seems to be spreading. I think the idea that the large banks in Italy, even in Germany for that matter, much less France, can those banks continue to be solvent if the country itself isn't in some ways? And the intertwining of all of the countries from a financial perspective is scary, because it strikes me that the German banks can go under if the Italians go off the rails. They're just so interlinked.
By definition, right?
Right, and if we're losing the promise of political union, right, that has knock-on effects on the actual operations of businesses and the banking sector in that entire region.
Yeah, and you're talking about the threat of populism, right?
I think pretty much.
Yeah, and that is certainly a threat.
We're living it right now.
Yes.
And our markets are doing what?
So, not without a lot of political uncertainty. I agree. And therefore volatility.
Thanks.
So the next item on the public agenda is a discussion of internal rebalancing of funds that I believe is going to be led by the Actuary's Office.
Good morning.
Hey, Mike.
So, as you know, the administrative code, the City of New York requires that these funds get rebalanced every year. And basically what that means is we want to make sure that for each fund that for those members who have not yet annuitized their balances, that the amount of assets in their funds equal their balances that they have. So if somebody's got $100,000 in variable A, there should be $100,000 of variable A assets in that fund for that individual. For those who have annuitized their benefits, we make sure there's enough assets that are equal to the actuarial liability or the estimated amount needed to cover that annuity that those individuals are eligible to receive. We've been doing this, as you know, for the last few years. The numbers this year are relatively small, just like they were last year, and that's because we did the major rebalancing the year before that, which was really a catch-up from prior years. So, so again, the numbers are shown in Appendix A1 and A2, the amounts for each fund that will need to be rebalanced or shifted within the plans. And the main reason for these balances to become out of balance and the need to do this rebalancing each year is really two things. One is for those who have annuitized, obviously we set aside the amount that is the actuarial value or our estimate of how much we need to be set aside. Sometimes people live longer, sometimes they live shorter, so obviously on an annual basis we need to shift assets around to adjust for that. And then for the members who have non-annuitized, who have balances, it's mostly due to timing differences, where there are certain transactions that occur that may not be, the transactions may not be based on the unit value that's in effect at the date that the transfer is made. So in other words, somebody might transfer assets in the middle of a period, but that transfer may be based on their unit value as of the past March 31, June 30, or the past quarter. And therefore, again, there's going to be a mismatch between how much, what their balance is really worth and how much they're shifting out. So that's really, it's again, just our annual reporting of this rebalancing.
So,
And-
Mike, yeah, question. So on appendix A2, it says the funded status is $32.7 million. So that the assets exceed the liabilities by that amount, right?
Correct.
So that $32.7 million, it's being transferred from where to where?
That money, because the plans are commingled, that money will really be attributed to the QPP.
And where is it now?
Right now, it's designated as a TDA asset.
But so, I mean, last time, when we did the big transfer, not last time, 2 years ago, we moved a big sum of money from the QPP to the TDA. Is this 32.7 million actually being moved? You know, and obviously most of it is variable A as it was last time. So is it being moved from one to the other or not? And from which one to which other?
This money should be moved from the TDA
To the QPP.
to the QPP.
So it's the reverse of what we did.
Yes.
That's what I was wondering. So now we're moving 32.7 from the various variables. Well, really just from, the only one that has a positive is variable A. So from the variable A to the QPP.
Right.
And then it's just another question so I understand. No, actually the fixed return, oh yeah, that's 2.1. Okay, but the ones that show a negative funded status, B, C, D, and E, so they get money moved into them, right?
Correct.
And effectively, will we move the money, and this might be a question for Susan, I'm not sure. Will we move that portion of the money from variable A to B, C, D, and E, and then take the remainder and move it over to the QPP, or how does that work?
Okay, I'm getting a little confused myself
Okay.
with all the different things, but we did have a meeting with accounting. Net, this can happen with our monthly rebalancing. It's such a small amount of money, net between A, B, C, and D, that if I try to do this off the top of my head, I'm gonna get it wrong.
Do you think Paul can help you?
Yeah, what happens is that the pension reserve fund really is the true up vehicle. So what happens is that to the extent that any of the individual funds need to be rebalanced, the offset is always the pension reserve funds. So to the extent that the variable A is overstated, there's more money that's needed, that money goes back to the reserve funds.
I see.
Okay, so and the reserve fund sits on the QPP side of the
Right.
house.
Okay.
Okay, so on page, the page before that, appendix
Paul,
A1.
Can I interrupt, Paul? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
When you said that the balance in the variable A goes into the pension reserve fund, is it the full 32,352,816, or is it minus the variable B, D, and C?
It's the net.
It's the net.
The reserve fund will be hit net
Okay.
of what's actually needed.
Okay.
And
So it's
each
not
one
the
will be
full-
made whole.
Okay.
And on the QPP side, the same thing occurs, but it has the opposite effect. Whereas variable A there is understated because the asset base is $6,058,000,000, whereas the liabilities are $6,169,000,000. So there's a shortage on the QPP side where the QPP variable A has to be increased by the $110 million, and that will come from the city reserve,
From the
pension reserve fund, from the pension reserve fund.
Okay, so the pension reserve fund is sort of like the liquidity pool.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And-
By legislation.
And how much, do we know how much is in the pension reserve funds? That showed up, does that show up anywhere?
I don't have it off the top of my head.
Okay, just
Is it
curious.
possible, just because I'd like to just review this with David and BAM staff, because I don't see them CC'd on this, just to get a list, I don't know if it's Mike or Paul, just of all the transactions. This amount goes from this fund to that fund, this amount goes from that fund to that fund. It's probably here, but if someone could just summarize it, that would be awesome.
That's yeah.
Thank you.
And you got to remember that these are on these are the member directed funds.
Right.
In the QPP side.
What was that
So
called?
it's not the member directed funds. So on the QPP side, it would be tier 1 and tier 2, the variable annuity funds and the ITHP funds.
So BAM isn't involved in the transactions like we were 2 years ago?
No, you are.
Okay.
You are.
Okay.
No, but I'm just saying that's like when they talk about, because you can see that it's the different variables. That's where that's coming from.
Right.
They have that. So it's only a tier 1 and tier 2 issue on the QPP side, and at some point that will go away.
Okay, thanks.
Paul,
Yes.
could you review right from the beginning? I once understood this about 2 years ago, where all the money went into a particular account for 20 years and it stayed there. And then we had to move it after that 20-year period.
2 years ago.
2 years ago.
What had happened was
Yeah,
the
so-
rebalancing in the legislation is supposed to occur every year. The last time it occurred, I believe, well, not the last time, but
2 times ago.
2 times ago,
So-
I believe it was 1993.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh,
So-
before that.
Before
right.
that.
Paul, can you
Right,
just
it's been
explain
so long.
where this money went to and why we need to get it out, just to refresh my memory?
Well,
Why do we need to do a rebalance?
the reason we need to do the rebalancing is the fact that when they do the actuarial calculations to determine what's needed to pay the future benefits, okay, it's based upon life expectancies of the participants, and what happens is that every year that gets reevaluated. So each of the buckets needs to be adjusted, and although we always adjusted the liability, we never actually moved the underlying funds until 2 years ago, and that's why you had such a large number, because it was spaced for 20-something years.
Right.
And now, since then, annually, you can see the numbers are less. The numbers were always smaller on the TDA side, because on the TDA side, it's predominantly the timing issue. Because you got to remember the way the non-annuitized accounts work, all transactions that happen during a course of a month happen at a unit value that's based upon the previous month's market value. So although money's being invested and dispersed, it's not being invested and dispersed at the true market value on the day the transaction occurs. So there are always going to be timing differences on the TDA side for the non-annuitants, and to an extent on the QPP side for the few tier 1 and tier 2 that aren't retired now. But so that's why even when we did the major exchange 3 years ago, the TDA numbers were a lot smaller than the QPP side. Okay, so what you're seeing on the TDA side will probably be a typical annual event, as long as we have those timing differences, and that's there based upon the legislation. Whereas on the QPP side, most of that, especially today, is on the annuity side. That will at some point go away because future subsequent tiers didn't have the right to direct the investment of their member contributions.
How come 2 years ago it was QPP going to TDA and now it's TDA going to
It's actually it's really not QPP going to TDA.
Right.
It's the reserve funds funding the assets, because you got to remember all the assets sit under the QPP umbrella,
Right.
and it's really a variable versus a fixed, not a TDA versus a QPP. It's where the accounts these accounts just happen to sit in each of the plans, but the rebalancing is actually the member invested funds versus the city reserve account.
Okay, crystal clear?
I thought it was pretty clear. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
I appreciated that.
If folks really want to dive deep here, if you look at the last 2 pages of the document from Appendix C, and take a gander, I had to take my glasses off.
Did you check to see
that
that it adds?
What's that?
Did you check to see that it is?
No, I didn't. I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna do that later.
Ask Antonio to do it.
Yeah. Okay, any further questions on the internal rebalancing? Thank you, all of you, for explaining it to us as well as you did. Okay, Robin.
Okay.
You want to introduce the next item?
Sure. So we have two individuals from a firm called Sustainalytics that are waiting outside to come in and talk to the board about what they do and how they might be helpful in the emerging markets country screening process that we are trying to reconsider. And Sustainalytics is one of really two firms, the other being MSCI, that have developed significant capabilities in terms of evaluating companies across the globe in terms of a variety of ESG considerations. And so that kind of data, much of which was not available or available at this level 5 or 7 years ago, will be an important component, I think, in any future emerging markets screening process. And I'm not sure country screening process is the right word to be using at this point, but in any way in which the board chooses to monitor its investments in emerging markets to confirm that they're consistent with their values and priorities. And so we brought in Verite last month, you may recall, to talk about the work that they've been doing in emerging markets around this, around the topic of evaluating company work in terms of labor practices, governance practices, et cetera. And Sustainalytics is really an organization that's very focused on data that I think might be very useful in the future process that we use to, again, confirm that our emerging market portfolios are consistent with the investments that are consistent with the values and priorities of the board.
So then, Robin, how will that work? So we'll listen to them today, and then you'll come up with a recommendation or a proposal?
Well, so I do think that we may be at a point where my sense is that there's some consensus on the part of the board to move in this direction and to evolve beyond the process that we're using now toward a process that doesn't require us to eliminate entire markets. And so perhaps the next step could be for Rogaton to collaborate with TRS staff and with BAM as well in rethinking this process and coming back to the board in the fall with a recommendation.
Be good.
Yeah, that's done sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
So speaking with our colleagues at BAM regarding this issue, one of the things that came up is they're actually in the middle of doing a search for emerging market managers. And one of the unique things that has come out of that is a discussion with investment managers about country screens and excluded markets. And they are finding that some managers have indicated that there'd be a difficulty managing certain benchmarks if there were exclusions in the portfolio. And that's one of the concerns that BAM has whenever they're doing an evaluation is making sure that they can provide recommendations that are the best to the board. And some managers have indicated just right off the bat that they have some hesitation about competing for business where there'd be certain exclusions that they don't think they'd be able to put forth a product that really represents how they focus their investments, and that's one of the concerns that BAM has. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. Mike Fulvio's been talking to the BAM staff, and I know Mike's not here today, but he's been having conversations.
Yeah.
Oh, good. So we'll do this as soon as we could.
Yeah.
I just want to ask another question before Sustainalytics comes in, and I think we ought to have a discussion after they come in as well.
Sure.
You mentioned that there's basically two companies that do this, MSCI and Sustainalytics. And this is really a question both for Robin and for BAM. my understanding is that MSCI produces this ESG data, which we get
Yes.
through the Barrow One platform. So, so we have the MSCI data. That's not to say that I'm just right.
Yeah.
I just want to confirm.
Yeah, and I had thought of that as well, but I thought we could hear what Sustainalytics has to say and what type of data they have, and then we can have the discussion whether that's duplicative of what we're getting through Barrow One.
Well, and the other thing I was thinking was that, again, depending on how this goes, we might want to have MSCI come in and explain what they offer to us as well.
Yes, but the TRS board, along with the other 4 systems, has already paid for
No, I
the
understand
MSCI
that. I think-
data that we
No,
have
I know we already
in
get
our
it, so we
first
don't have to
system.
pay extra for it, whereas we would have to pay for Sustainalytics. I think the question is, in terms of a recommendation, in other words, we might be able to use
Existing, yes,
Right,
yes,
platform
absolutely, and we would look
versus
into that, yes.
procuring a new platform.
Right, and so what's not clear to me is the level and breadth of ESG data that we're getting on emerging market companies. It may be entirely adequate for this purpose, it may be a more limited data set. So I don't know the answer to that, but we would certainly seek to minimize fees wherever possible.
And I think the prudent thing to do is, hear what, this group has to say, and then we can go back to the people in BAM who are actually deep learning how to use the MSCI system, because the learning curve has been, I think, pretty big. There's a lot of data in there, and they've started to be able to create the types of reports that we, have when we have questions that are in the ESG sphere. They now are able to run some of those reports. So I think that it definitely, to your point, would necessitate further conversation around what we have with MSCI currently.
So, is my understanding correct then that whether it's MSCI or it's Sustainalytics or perhaps a combination of the two, that they're just providing the data, and that we would require someone like Veritas, who was here previously, to work with BAM to go over that data, or is that?
My understanding, is that Verite has has their specific focus is on governance and labor, and the other ESG factors that exist in MSCI or maybe Sustainalytics is different from.
Okay.
I think the Verite is a little bit more limited focus. I think that maybe the investment advisory services that BAM provides to the boards might be able to be the ones who sort of run the numbers and then report back to board members, interpreting the data, coming up with a recommendation, sort of based on the questions asked. But it is raw data that somebody has to do something.
Well, I think Sustainalytics does some of that. But let's hear what they do.
Yeah.
Okay.
But let me just say, I actually think Verite is just labor. I don't think it's governance.
They don't, they do, I think they do some governance, they do some labor, they do some other things as well. They're trying to broaden out beyond just labor, but they have a significant focus on labor. But they also, because they have people on the ground in those markets, I think they may, and this is really a may, but they or someone else may have a role to play in periodically coming to the board and talking about what is going on in these markets, what are the trends, what are the issues that you may not have even considered yet that you should be considering, sort of an educational annual update. I think that could be interesting because these are obviously very dynamic markets, and the kinds we don't always want to be responding to what we've been concerned about in the past. We want to make sure that we're keeping current. So I think an organization like Verite could be useful in that regard.
Well, let me just say one point, which is I thought that in some ways the objective of this exercise is to move away, and you mentioned this before in terms of the agenda item, move away from a market or country exclusion
absolutely.
to potentially a company
Yes.
exclusion, which is, I believe, what Sustainalytics does, is they rate company by company as opposed to market by market.
Correct.
And so, which, you know, I have a lot of questions about, but I think is a really interesting approach. And it might actually be, you know, completely separate from whatever market they are traded in or based in, right? So that you could even have a U.S. company, U.S. based or U.S. traded company that gets excluded based on the metrics. You know, like, so we sort of talked about some of these U.S. based companies that have extensive operations in Asia,
Great.
and the Asian operations may
You have supply chain issues.
to have major supply chain issues, right?
Right.
Exactly. So anyway, I mean, I'm very interested in hearing the Sustainalytics presentation, and then, like I said, I think we ought to have some discussion afterwards, and then hopefully agree on some direction for local time to come back with a recommendation.
That'd be great. So whatever input the board can provide about the direction we should be going in, and I think this will be, to some extent, we're creating something new, so it'll be a little bit of an iterative process. But I just want to respond to a point you raised, John, about this could be applicable, this kind of process consideration could be applicable to US-based companies. So that is obviously correct. And it could also be applicable at some point to private equity,
Yes.
right? And so I think it may be important to draw a circle around what we're trying to accomplish here, and then use this as a learning process. And by circle around this, I mean circle around the emerging market portfolios, and then use the process we develop in for that asset class, and think about how we might want to apply it to other parts of the portfolios,
Completely
including
agree. I
US.
think that makes a lot of
Okay.
sense. Let me just ask one other question. Are emerging markets managers, are they permitted to invest in frontier markets at some limited percentage or not?
Is parametric? I have to look into that.
You know, the reason I asked the question is because, you know, so what we've done is right now we exclude certain countries from emerging markets, from the universe for emerging markets managers. And again, I'm just thinking that if we allow them to invest in some frontier markets, and I'm not sure whether we do or not, then you know, we may need to think about that as well. But if we're doing a whole country, a whole company thing, then that would take care of itself,
Yes.
as it were.
Yes.
So anyway, just, you know, I do think this is, I completely agree with what you just said. Let's look at what this means for the emerging markets portfolio, and then if we arrive at some successful approach that we have consensus on, then we can think about applying to other asset classes.
Great. Okay, so I will bring them in. I think we need 2 seats. I'm happy to move.
I would encourage you guys to come to the table. And feel free to, you know, ask questions, participate. Because who knows, maybe even Burrs might be interested in this.
Maybe even birds. Like I'm not even here, right? Like I'm invisible.
No, you are not birds here, my friend.
Okay, so.
Maybe Mr. Rich.
He's a universal fiduciary.
Yes.
He cannot escape the fiduciary obligation to anyone he is a fiduciary of, no matter where he sits or where he is. That's what the law is.
That's part of the fiduciary.
Give them all. And
Did you want to stand or did you want to?
no, I can just sit. So I'm gonna move, and you guys can sit on these 2 seats. Let me just get this stuff out of the way.
You guys have.
Oh, hello.
Do you need help?
Yes, can you help?
The cause trash place.
Trash place as I'm
Yeah, those are good for you. Please, have a seat.
Dr. Dallas.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks. I don't want to hog it.
I wouldn't give you one if I didn't.
I guess you're on, you're right?
Yes, I am.
And can I get your colleague, please?
Lazarus.
Sorry?
Was RLT on? I'll pass on my comment.
Do you want me to
Yeah.
start it? Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you so. Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to introduce you to our research and to speak a little bit further about how we see investors investing in emerging markets and some of the tools that are available from an ESG perspective to help you and give you the opportunity to monitor certain issues as they pertain to potentially human rights or environmental issues, etc. So just as a brief introduction, my name is Anya Solovyova. I am an associate director on our client relations team. This is my colleague.
I was RLT on, also a manager of the client relations.
Super. And so I've included an agenda kind of at the start of the presentation. And really the three main things that I'd like to discuss today is really first provide you an introduction to Sustainalytics. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with ESG research firms, but tell you a little bit about how we work and what we do and where we add value in the investment process. Also speak a little bit about the recent emerging markets developments in terms of what we're seeing that's helping increase disclosure from companies in emerging markets, but then also from an ESG research perspective, some of the steps that we've taken that helps actually us to calculate an ESG score that's fully comparable across companies in developed markets as well. And then also speak about ESG integration in emerging markets in particular, and speak to three particular signals that investors use in terms of evaluating companies in emerging markets. I would welcome any questions. I'm happy to kind of have more of a dialogue, so if there's anything that's unclear or anything specific that you'd like me to touch on, I'm very happy to do that. Is that
Great, sounds good.
Okay, super. So in terms of Sustainalytics, we celebrated our 25th year anniversary last year. So we've really been in this marketplace since the beginning. Sustainalytics, as it is known today, is actually a merger between a Canadian and a Dutch firm. So our headquarters is in Amsterdam. However, our CEO, Michael Jancy, has been a CEO since the start, and he is based in Toronto. We do now have over 400 staff globally. And we are located in 13 locations around the world. The reason I mention that in particular, I think particularly from an emerging markets perspective, it's valuable to have our analysts spread across the different regional centers in order to be able to provide the geographical insights from their specific regions. And then also maybe just an interesting point to note, kind of that speaks to the growth in the interest from ESG by investors, is that in January of this year, we were actually 350 staff, and as I mentioned, we are over 400 now. So I think the exponential growth of our firm really does speak to the increasing interest and the importance of some of these environmental and social considerations in the investment process. I will also note that we are the only independent firm that provides research at from a global perspective, and one of two that has this capability globally. In terms of what we actually do, so we help translate the vast amounts of environmental, social, and governance information that is available from publicly available sources, and help consolidate it, and then help disseminate that research and information to investors to essentially help provide additional insights that they can take into consideration in their investment process. We currently do provide research on 11,000 global companies, and so that is across developed, emerging, and some frontier markets as well. Great. I think maybe just one thing to note in terms of how we work, and I think this is one of the big differentiators between us and some of the other ESG providers, is that when we work with companies and investors, we really take a partnership approach. So we really want to make sure that you know how to incorporate the research and really understand it. So we really do take a partnership perspective. And maybe from some of the other partnerships that we have, maybe two to note that might be of particular interest is Morningstar is one. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Morningstar Sustainability Fund ratings. So Morningstar does use our company level data as the main input into the calculation of the sustainability fund ratings. At the start of May, Morningstar also launched a carbon portfolio risk score, also utilizing our company level data. I think it's maybe also interesting to note that we've had a partnership with Morningstar for the last 2 years, but they did purchase a 40% stake in us last summer, so that has helped solidify the relationship. And then another partnership that may be of interest is Glass Lewis. So they're one of the large proxy advisory firms. Last proxy season was the first time that Glass Lewis included some ESG considerations in the proxy advice statements. And now our research is also integrated into their platform to help companies from an engagement perspective. So kind of any questions about that before I kind of dive into our research and help introduce some of the main signals that investors are using? Okay, great. So in terms of kind of the research that we provide, what I'm going to touch, we provide numerous products. So everything from kind of ESG research, which is an overall ESG score, which talks to the environmental, social, and governance performance of a company. We also do have research that focuses on product involvement, so essentially tracking revenues from negative sources, so such as gambling, alcohol, tobacco, to help investors identify companies that maybe go against their values and be able to screen a portfolio on those. But today I do just want to speak to our ESG research, and particularly the controversy aspect, which I think from an emerging markets perspective can be particularly useful in helping identify any issues within the supply chain, etc. So in terms of our company ESG research and approach, we focus on kind of three main aspects. So we want to ensure materiality. So we want to focus in on the most material ESG issues as they pertain to a company. We also do provide forward-looking assessments, and that's with the trends that we provide for controversy assessments. And also one of the key differentiators between us and the other providers is the full transparency that we provide in our ESG research. So as an investor looking at the research, you are really able to see how we come up with our conclusions and how we come up with the ESG scores. And if you look at page 11, so that highlights the first 2 pages of a sample company report, and it touches on the 3 main signals that investors use as a starting point. So first, we have the ESG rating, which is essentially a score from 0 to 100 that's broken down into the 3 pillars. And there, in order to come up with a score, we measure a series of 60 to 80 indicators. We focus on 3 buckets of indicators. So we'll look at how a preparedness, so the types of policies and management systems that the company has in place in order to be able to address these environmental and social issues. I think it's particularly important that we're not simply looking to see if a company, for example, has an environmental policy in place, but we're really looking to make sure that we're looking at the quality of those policies and how do they compare to best practice. I will also note that we evaluate companies from a peer group perspective. So we have 42 industry peer groups. And so therefore, companies in emerging markets are also going to be evaluated to the same level and essentially measure the same indicators as their peers in developed markets as well. Then the second signal that we utilize, which I think in emerging markets in particularly is quite important, and that's the controversy assessment. So maybe just to quickly touch on how we come up with the controversy assessments. and the level of transparency that's available to you is, so on a daily basis, we do utilize machine learning technology to look at over 55,000 news sources. So we capture any negative environmental, social, or governance issues from companies around the world. We then have a team of analysts that will evaluate each incident from a sustainability and business risk perspective. And then if incidents related to a single event are assigned a controversy score, which is on this hurricane scale of 1 to 5. And as I'll touch on when I speak about ESG integration, that's one of the main signals that you can focus in, particularly for emerging markets, to identify any potential issues to maybe human rights, supply chain, governance issues, maybe around bribery, corruption, taxation, etc. And then the third key signal that I just want to touch on is that for every company and for every industry, we identify the most material ESG issues. And for the company, our analysts will speak to the key 3 main ones and be able to provide that additional insight to investors.
I'm sorry, could you,
Yes.
let me just, there are 3 key ones which you identify or your clients identify?
So we identify.
Okay.
So that's as a starting point for guidance to clients, is saying that when you're starting to look at the ESG performance of a company, we suggest that you start with these 3 key issues.
And that's the same for all companies, or it varies, or all markets, or?
It will vary. So
see.
for every industry, there will be 5 to 7 that are identified. And then for each company, the analysts will highlight the 3 most material for that company.
Okay.
And sort of to follow up on that, if we have a particular criteria that, let's say it's something like, there have to be over 50% women on the board of directors. How would a criteria like that become a signal that would be applicable to every company reporting?
Yeah. So something like, so board diversity is an indicator that we measure, and there we have a set standard.
But if your standard is different than our standard, if our standard is 50% and your standard is 30%, could that be tweaked?
So in terms of from an ESG perspective, it cannot, because it's an evaluation on that specific factor. We do have a separate corporate governance research offering that actually provides a transparency on what the board diversity is. And so therefore you could use that to dive deeper and to understand if that company meets your standards or not. So there is that level of transparency within the corporate governance research offering.
So it's customizable in terms of what you offer. It's not customizable in terms of creating specific signals.
I'm trying to think of the best way to answer that. So it's customizable in terms of how you interpret the signals, but the signals that we offer are going to be consistent, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So for every company, there are 60 to 80 indicators that we measure. But how you use those indicators is up to you as an investor.
So just following up, I'm just trying to understand. So you guys do your score based on your criteria. But if, following up on Susanna's point, if we wanted to take a look at the companies that had less than 50% diversity on the board, can we access your product to deliver a list of those companies or not?
So on the 50% board diversity, that's just something I'm going to have to clarify exactly for that specific indicator.
That's not the point. The point is whatever criteria we choose.
Yes, you have that level of transparency that you could look into it, and you could actually screen a portfolio on certain indicators. So let's say board diversity was the indicator. The thing I need to confirm is exactly what standard we use.
Right, what the definition, because if you define board diversity one way, and investment beliefs, or our IPS, we define board diversity a different way, then getting a good score on your definition doesn't necessarily match.
Yeah, so the benefit with what our research will provide is the full transparency on our definition, and then with what our analysts are actually looking for to get to that.
Right.
And in the corporate governance research offering, they'll actually say how many women are on the board. So that's information that's provided.
But that's separate, so if we're purchasing the ESG, that's separate from purchasing
Corporate.
corporate governance.
Oftentimes, we can just bundle them together to provide you both signals. Yeah.
So I guess the real question is, could a client use the raw data that you've gathered to build a particular signal and use that data to develop a different signal?
So you have transparency of the way that we evaluate it, so then you have the underlying information that's there. The raw data itself right now, so let's say the actual number of environmental fines a company paid. So that data is available as an explanation data point. You currently cannot actually screen on it, but you can actually look at a portfolio to see does it match your criteria or not. That makes sense.
So
there is a
limited
level.
Flexibility. There is some ability to see the data, but you can't manipulate the data to use it to create your own signal.
So at the raw data, so I think that the challenge is
Yeah.
that at the raw data, at the moment, that's not possible. However, what you will find is that the indicators themselves do allow you to drill into a signal.
Right.
And make,
Just sort of pulling the
Of course.
thread all the way through. We would have to have an analyst go through company by company, digging into that available data instead of just doing like a screen or a sort, being able to manipulate and use the raw data. And it's not a
No.
This is a learning enterprise for all of us. So we're just trying to understand sort of what's out there, and then how we can kind of based on what's available, craft our policies internally.
Absolutely.
Let me ask this another way, if I might. So, for example, we have another fund in New York City, which Suzanne and I sit on the board of, that also does emerging markets screening. And there, we have a scoring. So, like, let's just say, we use your scoring, and I have no idea what the universe is, or but let's just say that the scoring is we don't want to invest in companies that score below 30. I'm just throwing that out as a number. However, there's a particular set of criteria that are very important to us. Let me just throw out, by way of example, labor.
Yes.
And so, I don't know, the labor, like, I don't know how that scoring works, but let's just say we don't want to invest in companies that score below 30, or companies that may score above 30 but have terrible labor records. Is that something we could pull out?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So there you could actually set a screening report with those specific criteria. And labor, there's a number of ways you could think about it, and our client advisors can help you kind of pick which part of the research you'd want to add as an additional signal. So for example, from labor rights, do they have controversies in terms of maybe severe suits with their employees, or maybe there are certain other labor rights in terms of policies that don't allow for freedom of association, for example. So there's all those different elements that you could look for and screen based on your value.
Right.
Okay.
But we'd have
Understood.
to dig deep. We could say we don't want to invest with someone who is below 30, but we couldn't say we don't want to invest with someone who has convicted of a labor, wage theft violation within the past 12 months.
Maybe we could. No, I think she's saying that we could.
But we
if
couldn't-
that's one of their things. We could say everyone below 30 plus everyone who has been convicted of a labor wage.
But if
Thank you.
conviction of a labor wage thing isn't one of their signals
Well,
that
we have
goes
to see
into
what
the
they're
score.
No, I think she's saying.
So on the
No,
social,
this is the same questions as I asked on the board diversity.
Not sure. We have to look at what their list of labor.
what their factors are. So as I mentioned, there's 60 to 80 indicators that we measure. So they will fall across environmental, social, and governance buckets. So so something like labor issues. So that is commonly one that is screened out by pension funds, and we know that. And what they will use is any controversy that's a 4 or a 5 on labor issues. we provide a level of transparency that the first signal would be you would screen out any 4s or 5s. And then on those 4s and 5s, if the one thing that was important to you is if they actually had these lawsuits in the last 12 months, you can then look at only those 4s and 5s to see if the issue was actually around lawsuits or if it was another issue, and then make a determination there. So that level of transparency would be there, but it would require kind of additional evaluation at that point once you've made the first original screen on labor issues.
So it's really a question of what those labor, among the 60 to 80, what are the labor things? So
right.
we don't know if lawsuits is one or labor wage violations.
We just have to see if
Yeah.
what they're looking for and what we're looking for align.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. And we can also help kind of have that discussion in terms of, so you can say, this is what we're looking for,
Yeah.
and we can then look at our research and say, this is where it aligns, this is where it doesn't, but this is maybe where there's a gap.
Right.
So we
Or
can
we could
absolutely
do
help
the
you
thing
do that.
that Anya was just talking about, which is you could say, okay, anybody below 30 plus anybody who's a 4 or 5 on
Right.
labor controversy stuff, something like that. That would be another option.
And you can have multiple signals in that.
Right.
And so I know, for example, human rights, supply chain issues is a big one, again,
Yeah.
for pension funds. And our research is so granular that, for example, Berkshire Hathaway is flagged because one of their affiliates bought tennis balls from a firm that utilized child labor. So it of course, at the Berkshire Hathaway level, it's not a huge controversy because they didn't necessarily have the control, but it's something we feel that's important for investors to at least have the transparency on. We also will then, once that issue was resolved, we actually do provide a summary of that saying that this was the issue, however, that affiliate terminated their contract with that company, but we still need you to be aware that this did happen in case that was something that was important to you. So that level of transparency is available.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think, does that kind of help answer the question?
Thank you.
Super, of course.
Sorry to interrupt.
No,
your flow.
please. And this is exactly, I wanted to be able to answer these types of questions for you. So I think maybe just the other thing that we didn't touch on, so as the ESG rating, so there's preparedness, so we're looking at policies and programs. We will look at a series of disclosure indicators. I think they do have the least impact on the overall ESG score, and really we're looking at, do they disclose their carbon emissions, so the CDP, things like that. And then of course performance is probably the most important piece of the puzzle, and there we look at quantitative performance metrics, so things such as the number of environmental fines a company paid, the number of workplace fatalities, these types of metrics, water and carbon intensity trends. And then our qualitative performance is what we call our controversy assessments, which I spoke to. And there are 10 overarching controversy indicators that then have subcategories as well, so subtagging. So I think maybe just in the interest of time, I'll kind of just briefly speak to some of the developments we're seeing in emerging markets, which has kind of helped increase transparency of the amount of information that the companies are disclosing. I think the two examples I provided were China and India, but I think there are a number of countries around the world that are taking regulatory steps to increase transparency, particularly on environmental, social, and governance issues. And then the other development from a Sustainalytics perspective, which has allowed us to come up with a comparable ESG score to companies in developed markets, taking into account there is oftentimes limited transparency for many companies in emerging markets. And there what we've done is our research team essentially use regression analysis and a number of different studies to come up with the 30 key metrics that have the greatest impact on the overall ESG score. And so for those for companies with limited transparency, we will measure the 30 key metrics. So therefore, the ESG score that you will come up with is fully comparable. Because the key there is if we measured 60 to 80 metrics, there would be a lot of zeros across the board. So therefore, the score that would come up wouldn't be a very useful signal. So that's definitely helped increase our coverage of companies in emerging markets. And I think also important to note from a controversy perspective, the evaluation and the rigor that's included is to the same level, no matter if it's a company in developed or emerging markets.
So, can I ask a quick question? So, the Sustainalytics has been in business for 25 years, and it occurs to me that the level of transparency and information available has been on a pretty steep climb. So, what did this look like 10 years ago?
So there wasn't coverage of emerging market companies. Okay. I think that's the reality.
How long? Since when did you start doing the emerging markets?
So, so large cap we have had for a number of years. So I'd probably say some at least 7 years. For some of the smaller companies, it really would be since 2015. So really, kind of 3 years in history since we've developed this methodology.
Sorry, just one other question on your process. You mentioned that you use machine learning to screen 50,000 news sources globally, and then if the machine learning spits out articles, and then you have people read those articles to do the assessment.
Correct. So they'll read each individual tagged incident and they'll evaluate it looking at the sustainability impact and business risk. So that's first on a scale of 1 to 10, and then incidents related to the same event are then rolled up, and they're actually they're given to the company analyst, and or she is the one that assigns the controversy score, which is 1 to 5.
So each of these 11,000 companies has an analyst covering the company.
Yes.
How many in emerging markets, how many companies on average does an analyst cover, do you know?
Okay, so I will actually need to get back to you in terms of emerging markets and specifically. In terms of just general coverage, it is about 40 companies per analyst. I know that sometimes that sounds quite high, but what we were able to do internally is create efficiencies by using algorithms to be able to help analysts tag the sources of what they're looking for. So they're actually not having to spend all this time trying to look for this information on companies. It's already provided to them, which has increased efficiencies. Companies with very severe controversies or that do require additional due diligence, or maybe larger companies that have more issues, sometimes then maybe an analyst will only cover 10 in those cases. So it's really kind of it is taken a case by case, company by company basis. I will also note in terms of kind of the additional due diligence we have around controversies, because we do know it's a signal that investors use in their daily process, and it's very important. So anytime a company reaches a controversy 4 or 5, the analyst has to sit in front of an events oversight committee, which is made up of senior members of the research staff, and defend their views. And then in order to get approval to sign that score. And I will note, so they meet every 2 weeks, not everything gets approved. So there is there's very strict criteria. And also actually companies that will fall out of that. So maybe companies that have improved, and our analysts say, okay, maybe we're going to drop them down to a 3. They also have to defend that.
That was going to be kind of one of my other questions, just about the timeliness of your data. So is it just sort of continuous if we're running reports and we're taking a look at this annually? How fresh is the data that we're looking at?
That's a great question. Thank you for doing that. So the full company reports are evaluated on an annual basis. That's all the policies and management systems. However, the controversies are captured on a daily basis and are evaluated continuously. They're updated in the reports every 2 weeks. And part of that reason is because we want to ensure that the analyst has all the information when they are actually coming up with that controversy score. However, in the cases of black swan events, so Equifax, Facebook, etc., in those cases, we will make every effort to provide guidance within 48 hours and update the reports. And in those situations, in addition to the full assessment that the analyst provides, kind of as part of the standard reports, they will issue additional guidance speaking to the environmental and social and governance risks in particular.
And when something happens and you change the reports, do we get a notification?
So our online system does have the ability to upload a portfolio and set bi-weekly alerts on controversies. So if there's any controversies, you'll get an alert. And you can set it on a portfolio or an investable universe, or up to you. And then in the Black Swan events, the additional guidance will actually go to all of our clients. And so then, I'm very conscious of your time, so I just want to make sure that the other just aspect that I just wanted to cover was ESG integration in emerging markets. And I think we've spoken to a number of these issues already. So from the first signal in terms of ESG score percentile, so maybe anytime a company is below the 50th percentile for its industry group, that would automatically set a flag for additional due diligence in terms of what are those issues associated with the company. And then, of course, we've discussed the controversy exposure. I think in particular, there's been a number of studies done by some of our clients that have shown that excluding companies with extreme controversial behavior can actually help improve the returns of the portfolio. And I think in emerging markets in particular, it's a very useful signal. And then the other potential tool you could utilize is the UN Global Compact compliance. So there, it's updated on a quarterly basis, but we have a dedicated research team that evaluates companies looking at their compliance with the UN Global Compact principles. And those are, the principles are around human rights and labor, etc. So I think anytime a company is maybe on a watch list or non-compliant, that could be an additional screen you could use. And then the last case study that I kind of outlined here was a large Canadian pension plan. And here I just wanted to maybe just highlight two things. So one, in terms of the quantitative fundamental analysis, is done in the exact same way for as developed markets. So they do look at controversies and the overall ESG scores and flag companies for additional due diligence. But then also that in 2009, they started engagement activities. And I think from the feedback that they've provided, some of those have been quite successful. And particularly, they focus on companies in China from a real estate perspective. So really ensuring that they're flagging environmental and social considerations when actually building new buildings. And then also, one of the things that they note that has been successful and has helped them feel comfortable investing in emerging markets is participating in organizations such as the Asian Corporate Governance Association. So really they're provided with additional research that's helping them inform their voting decisions, particularly in China. I think that's kind of the main things that I wanted to highlight today. And maybe just important kind of point of differentiator between us and some of our other providers is the level of transparency, but then also the depth of the controversy assessment. I think kind of from what we've seen in the market, we're the only ones that go to the depth that we do from that perspective, to really provide you with kind of the most up-to-date, timely information and to help you set up the screens in order to ensure that your investments align with your values or your investment considerations.
I have a question.
Sure.
So you have this 1 to 100 rating. So presumably, the lowest scored companies are the ones that, you assess have the highest ESG risk.
Yes.
And then conversely, the higher scoring companies presumably have the, the best ESG performance or whatever. Do you have clients that not only use the product to, essentially underweight or screen out the lower performers as the highest risk, but actually seek out the highest performers for, overweighting? I guess overweighting would be the thing.
Yes, so that is one of the ways that the research can be used in terms of underweighting and overweighting in a portfolio. One other, interesting use case has been around momentum. So looking at companies that maybe perform kind of in the middle, but are showing improvements over time. So that could be a potentially positive signal.
Okay.
And actually, maybe also just another use case of the research, particularly in the controversies, what we're starting to see is clients are really paying attention to controversy 3 with a negative outlook, because that oftentimes is a sign of future issues to come.
I have a question. Do you have just a fixed pricing? In other words, you subscribe or whatever the right term is, and it's one price. I mean, assuming you just do the ESG service, not the corporate governance service. You talked about bundling the corporate governance service, but I'm just curious. I mean, I'm not sure I can ask what the price is. That may not be permissible, but just I'm curious into the structure of pricing.
The structure, absolutely. So the way that we determine price is based on the research universe primarily. So are you just looking at U.S. companies, emerging markets, developed, or whatever? And then we're looking at the access point. I think for your purposes, it's probably our online portal, which allows you to actually build reports on certain criteria and screen. And then also has all the qualitative information. And then really we're looking at the use case. I think for asset owners such as yourselves, it is a lower price point than for an asset manager, for example, because really your purpose is to monitor your portfolios, right?
Yes.
For the most part.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So that's really kind of what determines the price. And we also do have the ability to split out ESG and just provide you with controversy screening as well. That was something that was of interest, kind of at a significantly lower price point.
So that then you just get the controversy thing, not the whole ESG here.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Got it.
But I know sometimes that's a good starting point. Are there any other questions that we can
Mr.
answer?
Question, John? So,
Yes.
can I ask you, do you have analysis as to how your algorithm has changed over time? And then also, is there a lot of, in the database, as you look at this, the distribution of all these companies you follow, is there significant shifting within, call it cohorts, you know, the at-risk cohort, the bad cohort, the good cohort? Is there significant shifting over time?
Yeah, so that's also a really good question. I think maybe what you're asking about is kind of how our methodology potentially changed over time in terms of the indicators that we're measuring.
Yep.
Was that your question? So I think for the most part, we try to keep the methodology. The methodology has, for the most part, been consistent in terms of the large theoretical framework. However, there are certain cases where we've added or subtracted indicators based on materiality and what our clients find to be important. So for example, we previously had an indicator that measured the philanthropic activities of companies. That no longer is included because that's no longer relevant. An indicator we've added is looking at companies' palm oil policies, because that's only come to light kind of about 7 years ago, I believe, where it became kind of important to evaluate. So then we've added that indicator. And then in terms of, so we do have historical data going back to 2009. We have increased coverage every year, so we don't backfill history, but we do kind of have general trends. And we do have, and can provide you some examples of trends. Maybe, for example, we just published a blog looking at Chinese companies, one where they've improved in their environmental scores, but haven't done so well in their governance scores in terms of improvement. So that's something that we've been able to show and look at. So we've done a number of those kind of studies across the board.
But you could specifically say, in this cohort, which are you consider unacceptable currently, there's some probability that they will be acceptable over time, based on history?
Yes, exactly. So you can look at that in the history, yeah, absolutely. And we do oftentimes, asset managers, kind of before they become clients, they will take our historical data sets and do back testing on portfolios on different elements. And that's available to the indicator level.
Other questions? Great. Thank you very much for coming.
Absolutely.
Really interesting.
Thank you.
presentation.
Absolutely. And if there's any follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you. Of course.
Okay, so discussion, a little bit of discussion, of course. Anybody want to make any comments?
Can I ask you a
Rich,
question?
a really good question.
Well, how would you bake this in to a money management contract such that it changed over time and the manager couldn't predict where it would go? I mean, I can tell you as a money manager who negotiated these things, we wouldn't manage money for someone like that because you couldn't tell where it would go.
I'm not sure I follow the question.
You know,
Well, you have an uncertain criteria which varies over time, which cannot explicitly be predicted because the algorithm changes over time, and is driven in some part by, call it, an individual's interpretation of existing facts, which can also change over
Well,
time. And how do you put it in the contract?
The way I would put it is, look, you're gonna have a universe of companies that you would exclude, right? And that universe could change every so often. It could change every year. It could change.
Are you talking about the money manager's perspective now? So
Yeah.
I think money managers, frankly, I don't think money managers use this to make portfolio exclusion or investment decisions. I think it's just a data input. I think that money managers are trying to be more sensitive, and I'm not talking about ESG specific mandates. I'm talking about general money managers who are trying to be able to say, in a sincere and honest way, we are aware of ESG issues. We think we can integrate those into our fundamental research process. And they need a source of data for that. And so they use either MSCI or Sustainalytics as a source of data in addition to their own company analysts to just as a data input. So it's sort of interesting you have that reaction, because I have almost the opposite reaction, that this is such a nascent art / science that if their methodology wasn't evolving, I would be concerned, because I think the data sources and the data quality is changing so significantly that they are in a learning mode, much as we are too. So I think, particularly for money,
and I'm not questioning whether a money manager could use this tool.
Yeah.
And I would ask the question of, is the Canadian example, is that someone who actually manages money?
I think, Sandy, is your point more that,
how would we
that
use
the
the
pension
tool?
funds would be disadvantaged in hiring and dealing with managers if the managers had reservations about
Us
having
applying the
these,
tool.
having these standards that might change over time? And if I could just say, I think that, we're currently dealing with that. Different funds have different standards and different limitations that money managers have to adhere to. And, we've currently heard from some of them that they're having, questions about getting our business, basically, because of the exclusions.
Right.
So I think Sandy's point is well taken, and the board has to decide what's more important. Our values and our belief that these represent risks that we don't want to have to deal with, or hearing from money managers that they want to be able to do things free reign without different limitations.
Right, and to add on to that, I don't think, I did not envision that we would use this data or MSCI data to create rules for money managers. Rather, it would be a tool. So this is one way to approach it. This would be a tool to periodically look at our portfolio and say, is there anything that we should be talking with the money managers about? Is there anything that is so extreme in its score or level of controversy that we should be consider excluding? And I think that would be sort of a tail event, right? And I think it's a way of migrating from a policy now where we exclude almost a third of the emerging markets benchmark to a policy where the board, rather than just saying we're okay with anything, to say we're going to have a methodology for reviewing and evaluating our portfolio, just to make sure we have a level of comfort that there isn't anything in that portfolio that conflicts significantly with our priorities.
And I had thought that we would use it some sort of at a, a little bit higher level to kind of look at the universe, look at the potentialities with regard to the portfolio, and set some kind of bottom line standard. So now our standard is there are certain countries we can't invest in, and now we're trying to look at it, perhaps from a company level, but there could be certain standards at a company level, like basic ESG standards. We do not want our managers to invest with companies that flagrantly pollute the environment. We just don't.
Well,
And
yes.
maybe we would hope that the people we choose to invest our money wouldn't want to invest with those companies either. But I think as a reflection of the board's values, we might want to explicitly state basic things and
Yes.
not too detailed.
So short answer is yes, absolutely. The question is, how do you implement that?
Right.
So one way you could implement that is to have a set of explicitly stated investment beliefs. We don't think that we think that there are externalities and costs to being significant polluter, to violating sustainability and environmental standards, and we wish to not be invested in those kinds of companies. And then you communicate those to your managers, make certain that those are standards that they also believe in, and then periodically evaluate the portfolio to make sure that there are no outliers with respect to those beliefs. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to say, here's a score, don't invest in anything below that score. I think that's a little more rigid, and that gets to, the score is a number, and do you really want to use a single number to guide decisions?
Yeah, I think we have to keep, I'm not saying advocating one way or the other, but I know it's complicated. We have to figure it out, because we don't want to say, only if you have over 50% women on the board. That's limiting things. How can we be a little bit more nuanced?
Now, earlier we were talking about MSCI data, and so I guess my question at this point is the data that BAM gets now, and you won't have this information here, but it's just for me to say out loud. I think it's not only about whether or not we have the data, but does BAM have the staff to analyze it in the way that Sustainalytics is analyzing it? Because the data may be exactly the same, and we may not have the staff at BAM to make sense of it and reiterate it in a way to us.
Right. That's my sense as well. When we think about implementation, and we think about what kind of information does the board want to receive, and if it is going to a package report like this, that's not something that BAM is currently set up to do using MSCI data. So first, as we discuss what we want, then we can figure out who the different options are. And I don't know if we want to bring MSCI in to talk about, and have BAM staff here, what they can do that's similar to this, because it's probably not the product that BAM has, or maybe it's an add-on to the product. I think there was a per search cost that MSCI has, so if we wanted a report like this, they could do it, but it's a upsell, up price.
But I do think we get the ESG scoring. We may not have the same, she made a big point about the transparency they provide, so it may be that we just get the scoring, but we don't get the same degree of transparency from MSCI, but I think that is worth exploring. And I also remember that we had a manager in this year, I believe it was this year, who did ESG assessments themselves and used the MSCI data to do that assessment. So it's sort of like using the MSCI data to do their own version of this thing that they do. And they showed us their whole ESG risk assessment thing.
I think David's point, someone has to do that.
No, I understand. But truth be told, we're just throwing out ideas. My guess is that if we do get the data from MSCI, it would be cheaper, it might not be as effective for us to hire, or for BAM to hire, a analyst to use that data to create what we want, as opposed to hiring a whole company to do it. Again, we might not get enough, but it might be something worth exploring, depending on what we do get from MSCI.
It sounds to me like that would be something that we'd have to build from scratch.
Potentially, but it may
Right.
be that
Whereas we
MSCI
have-
provides enough that you don't really have to build it from scratch. I think it's worth exploring. I'm not saying I don't know.
Yeah,
And,
I'm not
you know,
saying it's not a good option.
So one idea to follow up on this is, because the permutations are
Yeah,
endless,
endless, right.
because we're creating something a little bit different than has existed, that my suggestion would be that Rogathon, in collaboration with BAM and with TRS staff, try to think about what do we really want to get, and then sit down and talk. The good news is there's really two people to talk to. Talk to Sustainalytics and MSCI and say, this is where we think we're going.
Right.
Tell us
what you can
what you could do for us, about how much it would cost, just to get orders of magnitude, and incorporate the existing relationship, so that we get a sense of what is the incremental cost of doing that.
Right. I completely agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. I also think, and the thing I'm struggling with right here is that when we initially had this discussion, and we said maybe what we should do is involve, like right now we exclude these entire markets, and that maybe the time has come to revisit that, because there may be companies in those markets that are actually very good, right? And then there may be other companies that are not so good. And so what we talked about is shifting from a country-based screen to a company-based screen. Now, the direction that this discussion is taking is not and I'm not sure, I don't know what I believe, I just want to point this out, it's evolving from a discussion about a country-based screen to a company scoring thing, but not necessarily a screening thing, you know what I mean? And so I think there's a question about whether right now we get direction to our EM managers that says, don't invest in these countries. And like the way I imagined it, but I couldn't really imagine it, to be honest, I had trouble with this, is we would tell these companies, managers, we would tell these managers, okay, here are this set of companies that we are excluding from our portfolio because they are outliers as far as ESG, and we don't want our assets. We believe it's too risky to invest our assets in those companies. But what we may feel like, first of all, that list of companies is going to change from time to time, and it's very hard to say to a manager, oh, this year you can invest in XYZ, but a year from now, oh, XYZ has dropped and we don't want you to invest in them anymore.
Can I interrupt just for a second? Because I think this is what my question led Robin to try to tease out, that there are different ways of using that. Because
Right.
Sandy's question was, will managers want to work with us if we say you can't invest in these companies, and this list is going to change, maybe it's going to change in 2 weeks, maybe it's going to change in a year.
Well, you could say on a periodic basis. whatever the
But
period
what
is.
Robin described, I don't know if she wants to say it again, or I think
Always happy to repeat myself.
No, I'm just saying, right.
Yes, so that's right. So I think what we're moving away from is this screening concept. Not only, and I think it's consistent with the discussion we've had about divestment policy, which is we want to focus more on engagement and rather than divestment. And so this gives us the opportunity to, again, espouse these principles to our managers, make sure they understand it, monitor the portfolio to make sure the portfolios are consistent with those principles, and where they're not, to evaluate those specific instances to see if engagement is possible. If engagement is not possible, is divestment the right move? So this is not abandoning the board's prerogative to exclude companies at all. It's just saying we're not going to do it ex ante.
And the old screen that or at least the one that I saw that NICERS has.
Yes.
Right. That was based on scoring as well.
Annual scoring.
Yes.
Right.
And
That
in fact, the
excluded
countries do
those
change.
countries.
Yeah.
So
Those
I mean,
countries
so
do
the
change.
scoring has to factor into it so that you know who to cut off and where. And I think my question would be, I understand that companies may move up and down off that list, or their score may change. My assumption is that a company isn't going to go from a 25 to an 85 in the span of a year or two, right? And
Unless some controversy.
Unless some major controversy happens, in which case we should know about that and get the hell out of there while we still can, right? But so what I'm looking at is that if we have some sort of belief system where we say this is around the cutoff for us where we're going to start to get concerned about a particular investment or a particular company. If a money manager is looking at making investments into specific companies and that company is hovering around that area, chances are they're either going to steer clear of it because it could dip below, or that they're going to at least go into it with open eyes and say, we think this company is on the uptick and it's not going to dip down. And so it's going to provide those managers with a way of knowing where we are and what companies they should be really looking at, what companies, you know what, this company's been on a downslide for a few years now, and in any day or any week it's going to dip below where TRS is comfortable with. We need to stay away from it. So I think it's very instructive for the money managers, you know, if they're utilizing the tool and we're utilizing it correctly.
Right, and I had, I'm sorry.
And that was the purpose. I think that's why we started this, rather than just countries that we stay away from. And that's it. We wanted to look at companies and we wanted to score them and we wanted to see, as Robin said, how we can engage in them with them. And so I think that's kind of good that it's fluid. That, you know what, we have our money with you and now you're doing something that's not right. So let's see how we can change that around.
And I think that was my initial thinking too, and I just want to, mention the excluded company list that, is being developed through the different divestment policies. So, we kind of have a list of companies that, MSCI data tells us are not compliant with some of the board prerogatives. But I think it's interesting to think about, instead of just having this hard and fast list that we already have. So I don't know if I'm contradicting myself. It's just that as we are doing this, we're also talking about. Are we talking about that here? Or just nice. Sorry, we've talked about starting a process for beliefs, a belief statement.
We have not started that yet. We've had a broad discussion, but we haven't done anything concrete here yet.
Because
we believe in belief statements.
That sort of starting with those big concepts and making sure that they're telegraphed at every level of what we do. A tool like this could be very useful in helping us kind of monitor, as opposed to just having this kind of list that's based on like a number and things come up and come down, and then we, So I don't know which I prefer. I think we'd have to, if this is an implementation issue that we have to keep talking about, but I think it's cool that, the available resources out there are going to allow us to be more thoughtful, and ultimately I think it'll be much more beneficial to the portfolio and to all of our beneficiaries that we're able to have a more nuanced view, while at the same time really addressing the inherent risks that are out there when you invest in individual companies.
And easier for us to make thoughtful decisions, rather than we don't invest in this country or we don't invest in this company. This is why. These are, as you were talking about, belief statements. This is what we feel, and now. That list you were referring to, is there movement on that list, or does that list change?
Sure. No, it's for everybody. The list that I referred to is the excluded companies list, and that comes from any divestment actions that the board has taken. Yeah. So TRS has an excluded company list based on the divestments, and so our compliance unit monitors your portfolio to make sure a manager doesn't inadvertently buy a spin-off of some company that changed its name and all of a sudden, it's firearms or tobacco or whatever.
Just one other point, or just I want to make one other point, which is this could also be a hybrid. So there may be a country, or more than one country, that we still think we shouldn't be investing in. So just by way of example, not to say that this is the country per se, but we might decide that Russia, under the current regime, is just beyond the pale, so to speak. A little inside joke there. There's a few people around the table got that. So, you know, but given the nature of the regime in Russia, we might decide, and it could be borne out by this morning, by the way, that we really don't have confidence or believe that Russia is worth the risk of investing. Could be some other country too. Could be, or it may not be Russia. I'm just saying that as an example. So we could say, okay, Russia, we still don't want to invest in, we want to exclude that. But then these other companies, we do the whole scoring thing. How are you correct?
But why would what's the criteria then?
I'm picturing somebody watching and your email's all of a sudden being hacked.
Oh, my email. But that might be exhibit A right there.
Then you'd have to come up with some type of criteria not to invest in that particular country.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
which is...
Well, we could do that. I'm saying as trustees, we could do that if we decide to.
Well, I think you're just saying changing the process doesn't eliminate any prerogatives that the board has
exactly.
to do anything going forward. And that, but to that point, although you might not anticipate, and this whole movement is to get away from excluding entire markets, bringing in someone annually to talk about countries and markets might, I think actually would be valuable, because it would give the board some comfort that there isn't any broad market level issue or set of issues that should lead them to consider excluding a particular market.
Or should.
Or should.
Right.
Yeah.
So, for example, just to give another example, you know, Egypt underwent tremendous political change during the Arab Spring and then subsequent to the Arab Spring. And so, if you have tremendous change in the economics or politics of a country, you might then decide, oh, this is a country that we previously excluded that we want to invest in, or vice versa. And that could be true with a company too, by the way. You know, companies have undergo dramatic change. So in others, there still may be. There still may be, especially on a country level, I think, grounds for evaluating either exclusion or inclusion based on events that go on with that company or with that country. That's all I'm saying.
We would be able to get briefed by whichever company we choose throughout, because it's an ongoing process.
Not the company, I don't think.
Yeah, he means the analytic company.
You say. I'm sorry. Yes. The firm
Yes,
that
On your
we have a
recommendation,
variety of sources.
it's not that you're going to come and recommend it to us one of these companies, and that's it. It's an ongoing process.
Absolutely.
Because everything is changing out there so dramatically.
I think you made a very good point, Robin, about how there's this very steep curve where information is becoming more and more available, and there's more and more disclosure going on. And the fact that this product has only existed since 2015.
And the last thing that I'd like to say, I'm happy to respond to questions, is that this data, I have some reservations about applying a specific score threshold, because this data, while much better than the data of 3 years ago, still has a lot of holes. Mm-hmm. And I've occasionally sat at corporate board or committee meetings where they're talking about their ESG scores and complaining bitterly because they think the data is inaccurate and includes zeros that because the data, they just didn't bother gathering the data. So there's still a lot of imperfection in the process. So great, so we will proceed. Yes. Sure.
Mr. Orlando.
I feel like I have to say that since Mr. Adler always prefaces everything he says with "I have a question." So I have a question.
Who are you?
Who am I?
You have another question.
So, building off that point, I found the sort of forecast nature of some of the scoring to be terrifying. I'm not sure how much transparency there is on that, predictive regression analysis to assign a score for a variety. Yes, there are 60 to 80 indicators, but it sounds like some folks have 7 indicators and 53 of forecast projected.
Yes.
I don't love paying for, a model so much myself.
Right.
So I'm not sure. I think we'd want to know a lot more about what that looks like.
How many zeros they're trying to solve for.
Right, just
Yes.
globally and
Yes.
just as a product. Historically, emerging markets have been largely concentrated, right? There have been a few big companies who make up 50% or more of a country's sort of stock market index, if you will.
Yes.
Right? And then there's a bunch of other folks who are along for the ride, right? I gather that that's changing over time, but it does lead me to feel like excluding countries is not the worst idea we have, because if there's 3 or 4 big companies in an economy or a country that are sort of the entire wealth of the country are tied up in that, I'm not sure that picking amongst them is any better than excluding them, presumably, because I imagine big companies either are all good or all bad, depending on the country, frankly. And I'm not sure how our defining rod is going to, be able to determine that you're the brother of the president and you're the sister of the president and your company is the electronics company and your company is the water company, what the one's better than the other. So concentration in the markets kind of leads me towards feeling more biased towards the country screen than an individual company screen. And then there's, I think, the 800-pound elephant in the room, which is, where's the bandwidth for this board or the BAM staff or Rokaton or even this nice company to look at hundreds of thousands of companies?
Not hundreds of thousands, 11,000.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands today, right? But
Well, we just added 50 people in the last 6 months.
right. Where? What are they doing? Are they filling in the zeros? Anyway, I just, I find that the investment decisions that we make are largely based on the recommendations of BAM and our consultants, and that those tend to be in broad ISP, system categories, IPS, buckets. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, yeah, exactly. And that individual company decisions are typically made by the folks we hire. The noise that we're sort of reactive to is usually quite loud, right, and quite public. And we do have the ability to act when that occurs. But the infrastructure that we're proposing to build to do down the road the work that we're all desiring to do strikes me as expensive and challenging. And I'm just not sure where the bandwidth is going to come from. Even if all of that infrastructure gets built underneath us, and then what does the funnel look like that comes to the board for decision making?
So just a couple of thoughts in response. So yes, we don't want to build, we want a pragmatic solution that doesn't require a lot of expensive or time-consuming infrastructure, which is why I think using third parties and not hiring people to do it ourselves is probably the right thing to do, but we have to examine the cost of that. And then the second thing about concentration, absolutely true, the markets, many emerging markets are dominated by largest cap companies. But we're talking, we don't index the emerging markets. Long term, we're not indexing. I think we may have some interim indexing, index holdings as we hire managers, but the plan is to have only active managers in that asset class, and they're building much more diversified portfolios, not so heavily weighted towards larger cap companies. But let's come back in the fall and take a look at the potential sort of costs before this, not just in round numbers. We're not getting bids, but just in round numbers, and how complex the process is, and what kind of additional opportunity it provides the board and the members.
My final thought is just that, hiring a third party to do this means to some degree that we are relying on the information provided to us by the third party.
Yes.
With a relatively opaque view into the operations.
Yes.
And that for the board to rely on a third party could create uncomfortable situations from any number of perspectives.
I mean, I would just counter, it's a point well taken, but, what we're trying to do now is evaluate, the efficacy of the data and if we have any faith in it. Obviously, we take things like, a qualitative score with a grain of salt, but, if, I was pretty impressed with how they gather this data, and we need some objective standard. And if we say, okay, we're going to start with this data, we're not going to go to countries around the world and start sussing out this information. The data source has to come from somewhere, and I think our job is to look at what's available and evaluate: is this data source what we want, or is that data source what we want? And then to interpret the information that's available.
Sure. Well, I think it goes back to the point you raised earlier, Susanna, which is, there's a tension between the broad goal messaging of what are our values as a board and what do we care about. That's a different work stream and operational implications. David's company got a 27. They're very different kettles of fish. And it feels to me, momentarily at least, like it's a very nascent activity on the left hand, as opposed to the broader goals that we all have as a messaging statement.
Right, and we always have the option to continue doing what we're doing. The question is, nothing, to state the obvious, nothing's going to be perfect, but is using this data to get access to the third of the emerging markets that we're currently excluded from a better tool.
Right.
That's really,
That's
I think,
the key.
the question.
Yeah.
And so we'll have the opportunity to evaluate that, hopefully.
And and if ultimately we have some data from MSCI in-house, we could certainly cross-check, right?
Yeah.
And see if the information we're getting and the information they're providing seem to be at least trending together, or whether or not
Yeah, I was
we're
thinking
getting
that too.
some
It'd be interesting to
disparate
see.
results.
One more point, which is that throughout this conversation and others, this idea of developing an investment belief statement has come up. And so I think that we as a board may want to engage in a process to move towards that. It came up in the discussion about climate change, and it's also come up in this process. So not necessarily for today, but we may want to agendize a discussion about a process for arriving at an investment belief statement.
That makes sense.
Okay. Anything else on this item? Let me just say, Robin, thank you for engaging in this process so far and for continuing to move forward with it. And I thought that was a really interesting presentation of Sustainalytics.
Thank you. I think that's it for the public agenda.
Okay. So unless anybody has anything to bring to the public agenda, I think a motion would be in order to move into executive session.
Good idea. I move pursuant to Public Officers Law, Section 105, to go into executive session for discussions on specific investment matters.
Okay, thank you for that motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to enter executive session, please say aye. Aye. All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Motion carries. All right, we're back in public session. Susan, would you report out of executive session, please?
Certainly. In executive session, one manager update was presented, one update on a service provider was presented, and a list of contract renewals within variable A was discussed.
Thank you. Before we accept the motion for adjournment, I just want to inform the board that Antonio Rodriguez, who she wasn't.
You guys are okay?
We're okay?
You heard what Susan said? Yes.
Oh, all right.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. That Antonio Rodriguez, who's a member of the Mayor's Office of Pension Investments and a designated trustee here, is leaving our office and moving to the Board of Education Retirement System. So this will be his last investment meeting at TRS. I think you all know that Antonio has been an incredibly valuable member of our team, and I think with his analysis of the investment meetings each month has provided a huge service to trustees. And we're going to miss him enormously, but it's good to know that he will still be serving the city of New York at BERS. So I just wanted to thank Antonio. We'll have to find someone else to do those reports. A major task. Okay, so with that, a motion to adjourn would be in order.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to adjourn, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.